Grace Carter thought she had it all. She was the only daughter of a wealthy family, married to a handsome man named Lucas. On the surface, their life was perfect. Lavish parties, expensive vacations, and a beautiful home. But beneath the veneer of happiness, a dark secret festered. Lucas had married Grace for her money, not for love. He had never loved her. His heart belonged to someone else, someone who had been a part of his life long before Grace came into the picture. That someone was Matthew, Grace's younger brother. Matthew and Lucas had been lovers in secret for years. Their relationship was intense, passionate, and forbidden. When Lucas met Grace, he saw an opportunity. Her wealth could offer him the lifestyle he desired, a facade of normalcy to hide his true self. So, he charmed her, wooed her, and eventually, they married. Grace was blissfully unaware of the history between her husband and her brother. After the wedding, Lucas and Matthew resumed their affair in secret. They would meet in the shadows, in hotels miles away from the prying eyes of their small community. Their passion was undeniable, but it was tinged with danger. Every meeting was a risk, but neither could resist. Matthew was torn. He loved Lucas, but he also loved his sister. He knew what they were doing was wrong, but his feelings for Lucas were too strong to ignore. They would meet in the dead of night, sharing stolen moments of love and lust, always with the fear of being caught hanging over them. Lucas, on the other hand, was a master manipulator. He had convinced himself that he could have it all, the wealth, the social status, and his true love. He played his role as the doting husband well, but behind Grace's back, he was living a double life. As time passed, Grace began to notice things that didn't add up. Lucas would disappear for hours with no explanation. He would receive strange phone calls late at night, stepping out of the room to answer them. He was distant, cold even, when they were alone. At first, Grace brushed off her concerns. She told herself that Lucas was just busy with work, that she was overthinking things. But the nagging doubt in her mind wouldn't go away. She started paying closer attention to Lucas's actions, and soon she noticed a pattern. He would always disappear when Matthew was in town. The two men seemed to have a bond that went beyond brother-in-law camaraderie. Grace couldn't put her finger on it, but something was off. She decided to confront Matthew, hoping he could shed some light on Lucas's behavior. One evening, when Lucas was out of town on a supposed business trip, Grace invited Matthew over for dinner. They ate in silence, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. After dinner, Grace finally spoke. "Matthew, I need to ask you something," she said, her voice trembling. "What's going on between you and Lucas?" Matthew's face went pale. He stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, but Grace's piercing gaze cut through his lies. "I know something is going on," Grace continued. "I'm not stupid. You two have been acting strange, and I need to know the truth." Matthew's heart pounded in his chest. He had always been close to his sister, but this secret was too big to confess. He had to lie, had to protect Lucas and their relationship. "Grace, there's nothing going on," Matthew said, forcing a smile. "You're just imagining things." But Grace wasn't convinced. She had seen the look of fear in Matthew's eyes, the way his hands trembled as he spoke. She knew he was hiding something, and she was determined to find out what it was. Unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, Grace decided to take matters into her own hands. She hired a private investigator to follow Lucas, to find out where he was going and who he was meeting. It didn't take long for the investigator to uncover the truth. Lucas wasn't on business trips. He was meeting Matthew in secret. The investigator provided Grace with photos, text messages, and recordings of their conversations. The evidence was irrefutable. Grace's world crumbled. She had been living a lie, married to a man who didn't love her, who had been using her for her money while carrying on an affair with her own brother. The betrayal was too much to bear. When Lucas returned home from his business trip, Grace was waiting for him. She had the evidence laid out on the table, her hands trembling with anger. "Lucas," she said, her voice cold and hard, "we need to talk." Lucas looked at the table, his face draining of color as he saw the photos and messages. He knew he was caught, but he tried to play it off. "Grace, I can explain," he started, but she cut him off. "Don't," she snapped. "Don't you dare lie to me anymore. I know everything. I know about you and Matthew. How could you do this to me? How could you ruin my life like this?" Lucas was silent, unable to meet her eyes. He had no excuse, no way to make this right. He had been caught, and he knew there was no escaping the consequences. Grace's rage was unlike anything she had ever felt. She had been betrayed by the two people she loved most in the world. She wanted revenge, wanted to make them both pay for what they had done to her. "You have two choices, Lucas," Grace said, her voice shaking with fury. "You end this affair with Matthew, and we go our separate ways, or I tell the world what you've done. I'll ruin you, Lucas. I'll make sure everyone knows the truth about you." Lucas was trapped. He couldn't bear the thought of losing Matthew, but he also couldn't afford to lose everything he had built with Grace. He needed time to think, to figure out a way out of this mess. "Grace, please," he begged. "Let me talk to Matthew. Let me figure this out." But Grace was done with his lies. "You have until tomorrow to decide, Lucas," she said, her voice cold and final. "After that, I'll make sure everyone knows the truth." Lucas left the house, his mind racing. He needed to talk to Matthew, needed to figure out what they were going to do. He couldn't let Grace destroy everything, but he couldn't give up Matthew either. When he met Matthew later that night, he told him everything. Matthew was horrified, not just by the fact that they had been caught, but by the ultimatum Grace had given Lucas. "What are we going to do?" Matthew asked, his voice trembling. Lucas's mind was already working on a plan, a desperate, terrible plan. "We can't let her do this, Matthew. We can't let her ruin us." Matthew looked at him, fear in his eyes. "What are you saying, Lucas?" Lucas's voice was low, dangerous. "I'm saying we need to stop her. We need to make sure she can't tell anyone." Matthew recoiled, realizing what Lucas was suggesting. "You can't be serious. We can't do that. She's my sister." But Lucas's desperation had pushed him over the edge. He couldn't see any other way out. "It's the only way, Matthew. It's the only way we can be together." The night was dark and stormy, a fitting backdrop for the horrors that were about to unfold. Lucas and Matthew waited until Grace was asleep, then crept into the bedroom. Grace stirred, but it was too late. Lucas was on her, his hands around her throat, squeezing the life out of her. Matthew watched in horror, frozen in place as his sister struggled beneath Lucas's grip. She tried to fight back, clawing at Lucas's hands, but he was too strong. Within minutes, it was over. Grace lay still, her eyes wide open, staring at nothing. The room was silent save for the sound of Lucas's heavy breathing. He looked at Matthew, expecting relief, but all he saw was horror and disgust. "We did what we had to do," Lucas said, trying to justify the unspeakable act they had just committed. "Now we can be together." But Matthew couldn't bear it. He couldn't look at Lucas, couldn't stand the sight of his sister's lifeless body on the bed. He had lost everything: his sister, his lover, his soul. After Grace's death was a tragedy, but the truth eventually came to light. In the end, the price of their secret love affair was paid in blood and tears. Years went by, but the memory of Grace's death still hung over the town. The Carter house, once full of life, became a dark and lonely place. People said it was haunted. They whispered that Grace's spirit was trapped there, unable to rest after the terrible things that had happened. Neighbors claimed to see strange lights flickering in the windows at night. Some said they heard footsteps echoing through the empty house, even though no one lived there anymore. Others talked about hearing soft whispers that sent chills down their spines. The house became a place of fear, and no one wanted to go near it. The town was divided. Some believed the ghost stories, convinced that Grace's spirit was real. Others thought it was all nonsense, just tales told to scare people. But whether they believed or not, everyone agreed that something wasn't right about the Carter house. It stood empty, slowly falling apart, but no one dared to move in. Those who tried left quickly, claiming they had seen Grace's ghost, watching them from the shadows. Matthew was locked away in a mental institution, far from the world he once knew. He wasn't the same person anymore. The lively, charming man who had once captured everyone's attention was gone. In his place was a broken man, lost in his own mind. He didn't talk to anyone. He just sat in his room, staring at the walls, trapped in the memories of what had happened. The doctors tried to help him. They talked to him, gave him medicine, and tried different therapies. But nothing worked. Matthew was too far gone, drowning in his guilt. Every day he heard Grace's voice. It was always there, haunting him, like a ghost that never left his side. "Why, Matthew?" her voice would whisper, soft but piercing. "Why did you let him kill me?" Matthew would scream, trying to block out the voice, covering his ears with his hands. But it didn't help. The voice was inside his head, a constant reminder of his betrayal. He had betrayed his sister, the one person who had always trusted him, and now he couldn't escape the guilt. The voice filled his mind, leaving no room for anything else. It was there when he woke up, when he tried to eat, and when he tried to sleep. But sleep never came easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Grace's face, her eyes filled with pain and anger. She looked at him with a stare that cut through him, making him feel like he was suffocating under the weight of his own guilt. Matthew stopped eating. The food in front of him lost all meaning. He couldn't taste it, couldn't feel hungry. He stopped sleeping too. The nightmares were too much to bear, and the few hours of sleep he managed were filled with terror. He became a ghost of himself, just a thin, pale body with no life left in it. Lucas, now in prison, was a man without hope. His life of lies had led him to a cold, dark cell where he had nothing but time to think about what he had done. He thought about Grace, about Matthew, and about how his greed and selfishness had destroyed everything. In prison, Lucas was alone. The other inmates hated him, and the guards ignored him. He spent most of his days in his cell, staring at the walls, thinking about the life he had thrown away. He knew there was no way out, no way to undo what he had done. He was trapped, just like Matthew, in a prison of his own making. The days turned into weeks, then months, then years. Lucas grew old in that cell, forgotten by the world. He was haunted too, not by a ghost, but by the weight of his guilt. He dreamed of Grace, of her accusing eyes staring at him, asking him why he had killed her. The dreams were so real that he would wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, unable to shake the feeling that she was still there, watching him. Time passed, and eventually, the story of Grace, Matthew, and Lucas became just another dark tale in the town's history. The Carter house remained empty, falling apart bit by bit until it was finally torn down. But even after the house was gone, the memory of what happened there stayed with the people who lived nearby. Some said that Grace's spirit finally found peace when the house was destroyed. Others believed she still haunted the land, unable to rest after the terrible betrayal she had suffered. Lucas died in prison, a forgotten man. Matthew lived out his days in the mental institution, never recovering from the horror of what he had done. And Grace, who had once been the center of it all, became just a ghost story, a warning to others about the dangers of lies and betrayal.